Square, it becomes the massacre square or whatever they want to call it, or they put an end to Mubarak regime and give these people, the remaining people here, a chance at living a good life.
The words of Mona Saif, an anti-government activist who spent all night in Tahrir Square. You're seeing live picture now. Morning has broken there, and you're still seeing crowds milling around despite the shocking events overnight. Live gunfire for hours and hours, apparently being directed at these demonstrators in the square. We've been hearing first-hand accounts of what sounds like mob rule on the streets of central Cairo. The army doing nothing to intervene to try and calm the situation, despite repeated requests, demonstrators told us, from them to stop all of this happening. A few minutes ago, we did see live picture of soldiers arresting, or at least detaining, one protester who had thrown a stone in the direction of the anti-government protesters, and he was being led away behind some tanks, which have all been pulled out of Tahrir Square. Not sure, though, at this point if that means that the army is changing its policy of standing back, of pulling away from actually imposing some kind of order on the situation. Watching this horizon of Cairo is our correspondent close to the square, and who knows what today will bring. Can you give us your sense of whether the government must now make more comments about how it's going to handle this mob rule?
I think the government needs to make comments about how it's going to handle this mob rule. All we heard yesterday was a warning by the army for demonstrators to stay home, that they were expecting violence. They said that the message has been understood, it's been noted, and something is being done about it. We've heard very little after that. On the streets right now, though, the army seems to be moving, putting some sort of strategy in place. The tanks have started to move. They've been stationary for a couple of hours, and they seem to be repositioning themselves around the square, certainly in the northerly entrance area. I'm also looking at a group of soldiers. There must be about 15 of them. They've put on their helmets. They've put on their bulletproof tops. They've all got sacks on their backs, which are full. They're all carrying guns. They are getting a briefing from one of their superiors. So clearly they are preparing for something. If these busloads of anti- and pro-government demonstrators are indeed heading towards Cairo, I think we can expect another day of rage, another bloody day. If I can just try and explain to you this picture that I'm trying to absorb. In the center of all of this, you've got the museum, this incredible place housing ancient antiquities, a history that Egypt is so proud of. And just to the left, certainly from where I'm looking to them, is today's history unfolding on the street. Egyptian facing Egyptian. For the first time in at least 30 years, this freedom of expression and this kind of expression of desire for change has turned into a bloody battle. Veronica, clearly there needs to be some sort of guidance, some sort of political leadership to end this now. Mubarak did promise that this would be a peaceful transition, and we're certainly not seeing that happen.
What kind of morale is there? What's the morale like within the army? How disciplined are they? Have you heard anything about any division within the factions?
No, I think we've seen unbelievable discipline. A couple of pictures where you saw some very frightened soldiers. I mean, can you imagine, Veronica, thousands of people bearing down on you, even though they know the majority of Egyptians are on their side? It must be a pretty frightening sound. Many of the tanks were situated right in the middle of the fighting. You saw the soldiers standing on the tanks. They were holding back. A little bit of action this morning when those scuffles you were mentioning a little bit earlier on. We saw a soldier pointing a gun at one of the demonstrators' backs. But other than that, they have been very controlled. Every now and then they fire into the air to keep people back. If there are divisions in the ranks, it's certainly hard to tell. Of course, Mubarak is surrounded by two military men, the vice president and the prime minister. So you can certainly it is the military that is controlling the situation at the moment.
And what about the opposition? We have seen various groups come forward, the Muslim Brotherhood, the group of the former UN nuclear agency, the IAEA, Mohammed al-Baradei, come forward. There was even talk about unity among the opposition. There was a meeting that was held yesterday in the midst of all of these clashes. Are we expecting to see more negotiations or any negotiations at this point?
Well, there isn't much unity. There are some groups who say that they will speak to the vice president. He said that he would like to sit down with opposition groups. They said they'll speak to him despite Mubarak being in power. The other groups are saying, April the 6th, for example, al-Baradei, that they won't have these conversations while the president is in power. So, as you know, this whole group is made up of disparate people, young, old. There is no political allegiance. You've got Muslims, you've got Christians. So it's now, I suppose, who is going to take advantage of this situation? Which political party is likely to better take advantage of this situation? We're not seeing anyone at this time coming to the forefront in that area.
I just want you to also recap what has been going on in the rest of the country over the last more than a week. We've heard about massive demonstrations in Alexandria, in Suez, in Ismailia. What word of what's been going on there over the last 24 hours?
Well, I mean, nothing as large as what's happened in Cairo, but we have heard of battles, the ones that you probably wouldn't be seeing on camera at the moment. So smaller scuffles between pro and anti-government demonstrators. This is certainly something that is happening around the country. This clearly benefits the government if indeed they are behind the majority of pro-government demonstrators to be in the line of vision, certainly from the international media. So I think it's pretty much a scene that we are seeing throughout much of the country, not as volatile as it is here in the capital city.
All right, pausing now, if you wouldn't mind standing by, please, as we recap the events of the last 24 hours. Gunfire and petrol bombs have filled Cairo's Liberation Square in just the last few hours. There are conflicting reports about how many people have been killed. We are hearing that as many as 5 people have died and 15 people wounded. Al Jazeera correspondents have been telling us about how pro-democracy protesters have now retaken control of the square. We've also seen pictures of soldiers detaining people. The army's been accused of failing to intervene even as clashes turned violent. Meanwhile, on the international front, the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's spoken to Egypt's newly appointed Vice President Omar Suleiman, condemning the clashes as a, quote, shocking development. All right. Back to the live pictures. Oh, I understand that we can actually give you a sense of the way that things are unfolding via a map of Cairo. The focal point, Liberation Square, we've just seen pictures of that, where pro-democracy supporters and Mubarak supporters clashed. Fighting's also been reported at the Qasr al-Nil Bridge. Earlier, there were clashes outside the Egyptian Museum near the square. Loud gunfire was heard in the area and also here around the street called Sahel al-Ghalal. And one thing that we can impress upon viewers is that this is the heart of Cairo, the capital of this 80 million strong nation. It is really quite extraordinary, unprecedented to see these violent scenes, Egyptian on Egyptian, pro and anti-government supporters conducting these running battles and live machine gun fire ringing out, apparently firing on unarmed civilians. So let's get more on the online reaction to this developing story. Nazanin Sadri is at our Egypt desk. What are they saying online?
Well, Veronica, there's been plenty of online users from within Egypt updating their Twitter feeds throughout the night and into this morning. Here are some tweets posted in the last few hours. Manal has just written, after last night of brutal battles where many fell dead, we welcome the new day with this chant, the people want to prosecute the murderer. And referring to some of his fellow protesters in the square, Tariq says they are staying. If they lose Tahrir, we are all lost. And John writes, I'm home from Tahrir now. Can only hear the sounds of helicopters and ambulance sirens. Brutal violence in Egypt today. Well, medical sources have told us that more than 1,000 people were injured in Wednesday's violence. Take a look at these images posted on Facebook. The page says it's from a so-called makeshift hospital set up in Cairo to treat victims. As you can see, some disturbing pictures showing the aftermath of those clashes. We must mention, of course, that we cannot verify the images. Well, with media heavily restricted in Egypt, we've been relying heavily on some still photographs. Here's some from Flickr. This woman says, "We asked for freedom, you took away our security." And a mock constitution held up here saying, "We depose Mubarak." Get lost, I will die so my country can live. And quite a few asking for Christians and Muslims to unite against President Mubarak. This sign says Muslims and Christians equal Egypt. And one final one we thought you'd find interesting. Now, the reason why we've seen more online activity from inside the country overnight is due to the lifting of online restrictions on Wednesday. Take a look at this graph. We can see the difference in traffic as Egyptian authorities turned off the country's internet service on the evening of January the 27th. This was presumably in anticipation of the Day of Rage last Friday. There's been a total blackout since then. And then take a look at the difference since Wednesday early morning as internet providers started getting their services restored. Online traffic not quite back to normal yet, but much higher than before. Well, that's it for me for now. Back to you now, Veronica.
Thanks very much, Nazanin. Just want to mention we've had an urgent wire across saying that Egyptian television is reporting 5 people were killed in overnight clashes and more than 800 wounded in Tahrir Square. Once again, 5 killed, more than 800 wounded in Tahrir Square clashes, and that is reported on Egyptian television. We'll keep you up to date as more developments warrant. Just wanted to go on to the role of the internet in all this. As Naz just mentioned, authorities have been blocking online access in that bid to stem the spread of anti-Mubarak sentiment. But Rob Reynolds now reports from Los Angeles one man's efforts ensured the protesters were heard.
Absolutely. La shukran ala wajib, Yani. We'll talk to you tomorrow, okay?
When John Scott Railton learned that Egyptians were being prevented from speaking to the world through the internet, he couldn't stand idly by.
When Twitter got cut, I realized that I had contacts and it might be possible for me to step in and do something.
The 27-year-old Los Angeles graduate student started making calls. He had visited Egypt often and had a network of friends there.
For a period of time, I was able to reach all the people who I knew on their mobile phones.
He opened a Twitter account at January 25th Voices and began relaying reports nonstop.
I'm going to start the recording now. Just go ahead and begin by introducing yourself.
He put the audio of his calls online.
And they're the ones that are trying to use some sort of violence and antagonize the people.
When Egyptian authorities cut cell phone service, Scott Railton began dialing landlines, often reaching elderly Egyptians at home while younger family members were out on the streets.
I reached someone's grandmother, and there was something in her voice like an electricity. We get to the window, and then I hear her open it, and there's just this roar of chanting and voices. You know, Ya Mubarak, he's gotta go, right? And she's shouting at me like I can't see the street. It's like a carpet of people.
From Scott Railton's sparsely furnished apartment, a storm of voices poured forth. The dispatches and audio files have now reached millions.
The idea was try to give the whole world an earful.
He's just one person among many helping to thwart an apparatus of silence. Proof that in the era of the internet and social media, people's voices will be heard.